Culture Gone Bad is back with another very special episode today. We have a guest about whom we're incredibly excited.
Yes, yes.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Nicholas Clements, and I have had a keen interest in subcultures and subcultural life for maybe 45 years since I first accidentally found myself in a subculture.
And Nick, obviously some of our listeners wouldn't know more of your background. Could you share with us just a little bit, how did you get involved in subcultures? Were you part of a subculture, or was it just a passion you were interested in? And how did you manage to combine it with your work?
Okay, first of all, I'm not focusing on general subcultures in that sense, but on fashion-based style subcultures, or subcultures that moved fashion and style on. And getting involved in them is not something that you're invited into. They're very, very small. They're very local. They're usually very conservative. And they're usually, in the case of what Dick Hebdige called the spectacular subcultures, such as teddy boys, mods, skinheads, and so forth, usually working class. And I was living in the west of England as a child, and when I was about 12, a boy in my class said, "Do you want to come and join the Surf Lifesaving Club? There's only one person under 18, and it's me," he said. And I said, "Sure, that will make two of us." And that was a sort of accidental doorway into a lifetime of being involved with surfing. Only I focused on the style element of surfing as much as the physical and skill-based element of surfing, although you also have to embrace that, otherwise you're not part of it. Like I said, there were only two people under 18 in the club then, and now I think there's a waiting list of probably hundreds, I don't know, but probably hundreds to get into that club as a junior, because again, it's like everything. Things that were once local and authentic, if you like, have been commodified. Parents can see the value of learning how to surf and save people's lives through surfing, because that's what the club was about. And so they want to sign their kids up. When I joined, parents thought it was a totally disreputable thing to do, to be part of surfing. So
Which
again,
is an invitation to do it.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And so again, I think that's the other thing about subcultures, is they live in a self-imposed exclusion. They
Exactly.
don't want to be included. They're openly saying, no matter how much you like us or feel sorry for us or whatever, please do not include us, because that will kill our subculture.
That's another thing that Dick Hebdige says, indeed. The idea of excluding oneself by adopting a very specific set of ideas and a very recognizable, sometimes the bricolage, resignifying some items of popular culture in the opposite way, such as the punks resignifying the swastika, for instance, or things like that were perceived differently. But I wanted to go back to what you said about the conservative element.
Same. I was like, so counterintuitive to what you...
Yeah, exactly. When you say conservative, do you mean that when you are part of a subculture, you resist any change imposed on that group from the outside? What do you mean?
I think there's several things going on. If we just go, let's go to the first spectacular subculture as defined by Dick Hebdige. Just as those people that don't know who Dick Hebdige is, he was part of the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies, which was started in the late 1950s by someone called Richard Hoggard, but was quite quickly taken over by a British Caribbean professor called Stuart Hall. And their remit was to look into popular culture, which universities, even sociology departments, hadn't really been doing. I mean, sociology was new at that point in British universities. And so they did these sort of groundbreaking studies. And one of them was by one of the students, who I think later taught there, Dick Hebdige, who sort of touchstone work on subcultures is called Subculture, the Meaning of Style. And he defined that people like the Teddy Boys and the Mods as the spectacular subcultures, which is a great way of describing them. I mean, first of all, they're working class, and the traditional British working class have had socially conservative values. I think they probably continue to do that. I mean, that's debatable, but certainly a certain section does. And so I think what happens is bourgeois society looks at something a phenomenon which seems to be very free and is not constrained by bourgeois values, and they automatically assume that group, that subculture, are somehow adopting a very liberal view to life, approach to life, and perhaps they're not. Perhaps they're doing something else. They're expressing let's just. I've often called these kind of subcultures, the spectacular subcultures, as the working class bohemians. Being in a subculture that's style-based gives you the opportunity to be highly creative and expressive in an environment that you find comfortable and, to use a contemporary term, safe. That is often interpreted in the wrong way by bourgeois society, who assume that you're living this extremely liberal and free life in their terms. So I think what's happening is the bourgeoisie are imposing their ideas onto subcultures that just don't share very much with them.
The fascinating thing, which I'm a firm believer of, but it seems to me that you agree from what you said, but now you will tell me, is the fact that it seems that subcultures are in a spectrum where fashion is left, subcultures are right, meaning that there is no way that the two can converge, because the moment in which something becomes fashion is automatically removed from the subcultural sphere, precisely because fashion, unlike subcultures, requires the liberal bourgeoisie. This is my feeling, that whenever fashion feeds off subcultures, inevitably betrays their spirits and their aims and and their values and everything. It may look similar from far away, but then when you analyze them, it's not.
Well, I think first of all, I would say that the first thing to understand is subculture is not counterculture. Subculture is exclusive. It only wants its own, whoever they may be, and there's no application form to join, a biker gang or to join the Teddy Boys or whatever. You don't go to university and get a degree so you can get into one of these organizations or groups. It usually happens by happenstance, but usually connected with locale. You have to live and be part of that community, which is often very, very small. I mean, subcultures, can start as 10 people and remain that way for many years, and then maybe they suddenly catch the imagination or the eye of the media, and then suddenly explode and eventually become dissipated. So they're also apolitical. Now you're putting political labels on subcultures, and in theory you could do that, but they themselves are apolitical. They're non-political.
Oh, no. When I meant left and right, I didn't mean politically. I meant one is on the one hand of the spectrum, the other one is on the other hand.
But remember, the counter to subcultures is counterculture. And the counterculture is totally political and totally inclusive.
Yeah.
The point is, believe in what we believe in and you belong with us. And you can come into our fold. It doesn't matter where you come from. It's totally inclusive. And so if we look at the current agenda on, inclusivity, for example, you could quite easily trace that back to the counterculture in San Francisco in 1966 or 67 or whatever, saying, we have this vision of the world where everybody is included. And and we dress in a certain way. And I think people confuse subcultural dress with countercultural dress.
Yeah.
I often perceive what counterculture movement in San Francisco in the 60s, which we often associate with hippies in a visual identity. To me, this is exactly a representation of well-educated, wealthy middle class who decided to maybe ignore their parents or go in a different sort of societal dimension. And what you just talked about subculture, that's for me perfectly resonates with if subculture is working class, societal structure, which is exclusive to them, that counterculture became a very easy bandwagon to jump on, to say what, you know, we have these values by which we live and we visually identify differently, when in reality it sounds to me very much like a veneer of your existence which you can easily leave behind and jump back into your comfortable life. And I wonder, you having first-hand experience of subculture, living closer to the time of countercultures of that time, do you feel there is any sort of a difference in a way of how people would play with this idea, but not really identify with it in real terms of not going back? And do you think being part of a subculture is some sort of a bigger decision?
First of all, I don't think being in a subculture is a decision. I think just in the same way that the first subculture I was in, I didn't kind of realize I was getting into it or was in it, if you like, because it seemed like the natural thing to do at the time, because there was no motivation other than, well, I was there, so I might as well do it, if you like. I mean, then it developed into the skateboard scene and other possibilities. But I think that the counterculture is something quite different. If you look at the two epicenters of what we consider today to be the counterculture, let's say the campus at Berkeley, well, straight away, you're talking about a university. There's no, I mean, the Teddy Boys weren't in universities. I mean, maybe there were a few people in art schools who actually came from working class backgrounds who actually might have identified as Teddy Boys in some way or being associated. But the counterculture is a university-based thing. If we think of the Paris Spring of 1968, it was at the Sorbonne. So these are quite different. And I think if we look at the vast class or social group or whatever you wish to call them today, which tends to dominate in things like the media and you know, in writing, in films, in the arts and humanities, basically, they come out of that period. And I think that's not controversial in any way. That's indisputable. And they were the educated elite. And I don't say that in a pejorative sense. They were the educated elite who came through along the lines of the arts, and some of them have done very, very well for themselves. I don't think anybody would argue with that. That's very, very different to subcultural life, which tended to be, certainly in Britain, a phase that was a transitional phase. You have to remember in Britain that we stopped military service in 1960, and that's very significant. It was a transitional phase from early teenage years through to adulthood. And most, not all, but most subcultural members who maybe got married between the ages of 18 and 22 in this period, in the 50s and 60s, then stopped being members of a subculture and sort of became adults, if you like. However, there were exceptions, and those exceptions, those highly creative bohemian types who couldn't express their bohemian tendencies the traditional way by going to an art school or a university and expressing them intellectually, expressed them purely through style and through music. So one of the most well-known examples of that is a young man from the East End of London called Mark Feld, who later became Mark Bolan and started a band called T-Rex that became one of the most influential music and style bands of the 1970s. David Bowie is another example. And this, I actually have a sort of theory, a thesis that I've put forward, proposed many times, which is the concept of the subculture of one. The person who actually develops a sort of one person subculture. And Bowie and Bolan seem to be exemplifiers of that, although they learned their subcultural trade by actually accidentally falling into subcultures at a very early age, 12, 13, 14. So the bourgeoisie were aware there was money to be made in working class subcultures, either appropriating their styles and selling them on to the bourgeoisie, or starting clubs or whatever. So I'm sorry, that was a long explanation to Vivienne Westwood.
It's all good.
So Vivienne Westwood, I think punk, I should say, I don't want to go into Vivienne Westwood yet, but punk came to a point where it wasn't purely working class. Now, I can say this from personal experience because I was in London in 1977. I considered myself to be a punk, or it was a word hardly used in those days, by the way, or a new waver, as people often called themselves. And I went to many, many gigs at the Vortex, the Roxy, the 100 Club in Oxford Street. And most of the audience were art school students. Punk was, maybe the bands were working class, but the followers and the people who were interested in punk, which they politicized, were bourgeois. Well, not all, but were noticeably bourgeois, except for certain bands, skinhead bands and so forth, that were associated with the punk thing. And I think Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren just rode that wave. Malcolm McLaren himself actually expressed his interest in the work of Guy Debord and the Situationist International, and so immediately came in from a theoretical viewpoint. I'm not sure that the Sex Pistols knew who Guy Debord and Situationist International were. So I mean, you've got those two groups operating almost separately, and then they come together, and there's the punk explosion. So,
but in terms of, if you had to, let's say, project it on contemporary times, where we really hear term cultural appropriation a lot, do you think there was an element where we tried to commodify a culture we were not really part of, and we just really use it as a great opportunity, good place, good time? Or do you think actually doesn't really matter, and it was just natural thing, and if it wouldn't be here, it would be someone else?
Well, it would be I mean, in the case of Britain, and I'm going to stick with that because that's what I know about, it would be class appropriation, I think, rather than cultural appropriation. It's been done endlessly by fashion. It's like a sort of fashion sees subcultural style as a sort of gold mine that you can just go back to anytime you want, open the door and start digging out the gold again. And of course, mixing up subcultures is very popular. And that doesn't bother me in any way personally, because subcultures don't care. They move on very fast. And that's
I wanted to go back 1 second, because the fashion feeds off everything, not just subcultures. Anything that, as you said, represents an inexhaustible well of newness. So that's what fashion does all the time. So it's not just something that they do, as you said, to subcultures, but to the military, to the Queen Elizabeth, to the church, anything is gold. Garbage bags, yes. IKEA, everything. Very, very interesting. Also, you can, if you can explain to our listeners, you lived in Japan, right?
I've never lived in Japan, but I do business in Japan. I've been to Japan many, many times, yes.
Right. To this, in this context, what's your vision of, because the two countries probably that are most known in the West for subcultures are the British and the Japanese. So what do you think about their interpretation of subculture, and is it comparable, or do you think it's
different,
something? Yeah,
completely different category?
We are misusing the word subculture when
yes. Well, what the Japanese seem to have picked up on very early is that key word in cultural studies, which is authenticity.
Mm.
And that's actually a word we haven't mentioned so far, because remember, the weakness of the counterculture and the bourgeoisie is they perceive themselves as inauthentic, and they admire the authenticity of the apolitical, purely style-based subculture of the working classes that seems to have no aim or point. It's something they don't understand, so they perceive it as authentic. I mean, often when intellectuals don't understand something, they will either reject it or perceive it as authentic. That's why they don't, that's their explanation to why they don't fully understand it. And the Japanese have picked up on that concept of authenticity. So they look across 12,000 miles and say, or actually 8,000 miles to be precise, they look across 8,000 miles at teddy boys or punks or skinheads or whatever, or mods, and see something which is a non-commodified or less commodified, non-consumeristic or less consumeristic youth event, which is aesthetically extremely pleasing and seems to be imbued with this indescribable concept of being authentic. And authenticity with the Japanese is the big deal, whether it's a painting by a Constable or whether it's a Ferrari. They want the authentic thing, that to collect, to look at, to care about, to understand everything about. There's a name in Japanese, otaku, which means to be totally obsessed by something. Often we think about manga otakus or whatever, but this idea of being the ultimate collector of authentic items in a sort of personal museum, in a case of curiosities.
That's so interesting and true, because I'm thinking of the denim production. Today, they are the best producers of denim in the world. And part of the reason is that they bought old American mills. So they are able to reproduce 1950s trousers, 1950s denim in Japan, because they, as you say, they
obsessed.
They're obsessed, and they have sort of conquered this this domain of American authentics. So it's
they're subcultures, if you like, Jupi, because now we move away from Hebdige to Baudrillard and the concept of simulation.
Yeah.
What is real and what is not.
Yeah.
And in Japan, I don't think anybody, I mean, was described in the 80s as the ultimate postmodern society, because without in any way caring what Baudrillard thinks in any way whatsoever, Japanese society seems to enjoy, or seems to be have a tendency towards this concept of simulation, and it's particularly in fashion. So if you want to find the most hardcore mod revivalists in the world, you're probably going to find them in Japan, or the most sincere teddy boy revivalists, you're going to find them in Japan. Well, what happened in Japan in the 1980s is an interest turned into a possibility, because Japan went through an economic explosion, which was known as the bubble, when the value of the yen became so high that, compared to other world currencies, that if you were British and you went to Tokyo in 1985, a cup of coffee cost £20 in 1985 because the value of the yen was so high. So there's a reversal of that, is that Japanese youth who had been collecting American denims, original denims, went to America and selling them, but in a very small way, went to the United States and went to what they're called rag houses. You know, they collect old clothes and sell them for recycling, to be cut up and recycled as, you know, or used as for some other reason. They went to rag houses and just bought all the denim they could. They took out the stuff they didn't need, and they kept all the older denim, took it back, and I'm talking about from 1900 to 1980, took it back to Japan, sorted it into categories and sold it to collectors at extremely high prices. And I mean, you know, even then you could be talking about $1,000 or more for a pair of original 1940s Levi's. A pair of 1900 Levi's today could easily fetch $20,000.
Wow.
However, if you spend $1,000 on a pair of jeans, you don't want to wear them that are already old, because they will, within a week, they're going to get holes in. So somebody said, why don't we replicate these jeans really down to the last thing? And it came down, it's a bit of a myth. I'm going to, sorry to disagree with you, Jupi, but there's quite a few myths around this. They didn't actually get involved with US denim manufacturers. What they did is, Japan is an island nation. They love to be self-sufficient. So 5 companies, Studio d'Artisan, Warehouse, Denim, oh gosh, I'll tell you the other 2 and I remember them. I wasn't expecting this question. They individually, they're all based in Osaka. They're known as the Osaka 5. And individually, each little group said, well, we're making clothing, or we own a clothes store selling American denims. Maybe we can actually somehow remake, or Full Count is another one, a very important one. We can somehow remake this denim to look exactly as it was in the 1950s. And they thought it would be easy. All they did is they got some old looms. Some of them are made by Toyota, which is actually a Japanese company. And they bought these old looms and they made some denim, but it didn't feel the same. And they realized the cotton was wrong. And in particular with the brand Full Count, which is still going strong, they found that the nearest cotton they could find, raw cotton, was in Zimbabwe, in southern Africa. And so they started importing the raw cotton from Zimbabwe and then having it woven in a place called Okayama, which is quite near to Osaka. And now that's known as the sort of denim center of the world. So, and what they did is the narrow looms were only 24 inches, whereas a modern loom is almost, 2 meters, or can be 2 meters wide. So you didn't get much denim, and the pants had to be cut in a certain way, and they used the edges of the denim as for the side seams. So when you turned up your pants, this is what the Americans were doing. When you turned up your pants, you got that selvage edge, which is woven either side in the narrow looms. So today, people that spend 300 or 400 or 500 pounds on a pair of jeans, expect it to be made from that Japanese denim, that selvage edge denim, which was developed by people like Full Count and Denim and Studio d'Artisan and the other Warehouse and the others. And then that exploded into a clothing market in Japan based purely on replicas. And there's an amazing book by David Marks called Amatora, which explains the whole thing in detail. I mean, I was there, witnessing this and photographing people and interviewing people and everything. But the book is fantastic.
It's incredible. It's amazing book.
Yes, a very good book. So that's this idea of the replication of subcultures, which I think comes closer to a homage than a pure commodification.
And Nick, jumping on this idea of simulacra and the whole identity which Japan managed to build, what really strikes me, if you, let's say, meet someone, like average person, let's say in London, and if you strike a conversation about tourism and traveling, one of the first countries which a person eventually will mention is as an aspiration to travel to, or a destination which we visited, is Japan. And I find it incredibly fascinating how a country which went through such a hardcore war struggle in 20th century, then obviously economic boom, like you just mentioned, they managed to market themselves as the ultimate traveling destination. What do you think about that in the global scope of our perception of Japan? How did we manage to market themselves as such a desirable place and exciting for everyone?
Well, yes. I mean, gosh, I think that to answer that question, you have to go back to the Edo period, which is,
Oh yeah,
it's the classical period, or the one that the West understand as the classical period, and it goes from somebody's going to tell me this is wrong now. I think 1610 to 1868. But anyway,
they have been close to the West.
It's around that. No, they were close to the West. There was a little bit of trading, and one assumes, I'm making an assumption, but it's probably a reasonable one, that they saw what had happened to all of the other countries which had embraced the West, which was basically the West walked in and took them over, and decided, no way, that's not going to happen to us. And as an island nation, we stand a chance of resisting that, even though they didn't have the technology of the West. But they realized the way the West got in was to come with open hands and say, let's trade with you. And before you knew where you were, they'd taken over your country. So I think the Japanese were very smart in that way. They avoided, they were never colonized by any country. They traded with Portugal and Holland. They didn't trade with Britain at that period. Anyway, towards the end of the Edo period, in the mid-19th century, they looked around and realized that technologically they'd been left so far behind that they were vulnerable, and decided to completely change and sort of semi-Westernize. That happened in 1868 in a period called the Meiji Restoration, and they went from a military kind of dictatorship called a shogunate, where it was the military leader who ruled and the emperor was the religious head. They went to having a constitutional monarchy. So the emperor became like the British and Dutch and Danish queen or king, and they were taken, and they established a parliamentary system. Their rise to industrial power was so unbelievably rapid. They employed people from all around the world then to come in and build railroads. They employed a lot of British engineers to build railroads, to establish steel works, to establish all the things you need for industry. Although the West at that point weren't taking a great deal of notice until with the Japanese-Russian War at the beginning of the 20th century, when Japan defeated Russia, a world power, using modern weaponry. And the West suddenly stood up and said, oh my gosh, where did this country come from? I mean, you know, so basically you've got to look at that to understand what happened after their defeat in World War II. They'd already risen from a feudal society to a major world power. It's too long to go into it now, and I'm not a qualified historian. However, that rapid rise to power was partly what caused their disputes with the United States prior to World War II, which ended up with the attack on Pearl Harbor. However, I'm not qualified to talk about that, but nevertheless, the rise from the ashes of total and utter defeat by the US really was a kind of continuation of what had started in 1868. And so I don't think for a lot of people it was as surprising. Their attitude was to adopt one of total pragmatism and say, we've been defeated, let's now play the West at its own game, and instead of being the greatest military power, let's become the greatest technological power, which they achieved by the 1980s, which caused the economic bubble, which ultimately gave them the possibility to go and buy everything that was interesting from the US from the mid-century period. So now, if you want to buy a really, really rare Harley Davidson motorcycle, then you're probably going to find it in Japan, because it was taken over there in the 1980s and 1990s. So I don't know whether that answers your question or not.
It's
but
quite ironic how if you go to any, so let's say mid-19th century Victorian house in UK, you will find lots of imports were brought specifically also from Japan, which obviously were created probably and catered to Western taste. But I think it's quite ironic how tables in a way have turned a little bit, and how Japan started to import all the Western symbols and products to their country, and how Victorian society used to be obsessed with importing everything from what we call Oriental world.
And replicating, because the Art Nouveau as well looked at Japanese.
Yeah, but also, like, where did I go? I went to, I traveled a little bit over the last week around UK, and I went to some old Victorian houses like Russell Courts, and also, anyway, and they had lots of obviously Japanese inspired panels, vases, and wallpapers. But what was very specific, what I wrote in the descriptions of all that, the patterns, the colors, they were not traditionally Japanese. They all were created to soften the Western idea of beauty and aesthetics. So I think our world is incredibly complex, and
it's
we
very
like
complex.
To take inspirations from subcultures, from countries which have nothing to do with us, but we really like to have a piece of that.
And they like to have a piece of us, of course, which is it makes the world an exciting place to be, is exchange. I mean, exchange is the great thing. I mean, Japan had huge industries in providing ceramics and lacquerware, you know, wooden polished wood for the West, of course, because after 1868, when they decided to Westernize, they needed foreign currency. They needed to trade with the West, and they couldn't trade steel. I mean, interestingly, they discovered steel very early, but they didn't have giant steel works. They couldn't get involved in building gigantic ships and things. They just didn't have the technology. So what they did have was ceramics, silks, and things made of wood. So actually, what's interesting is they needed that foreign currency in order to fund this new way of life that they wanted to adopt. Within Japan, there was a backlash to this, which happened later in the 19th century, where the military stepped in, and this is part of the militarization of Japan that happened in or the remilitarization of Japan that happened in the late 19th century, is the military, and said, this westernization is going too far. What's interesting is in Japan, it's never lost its identity, and that's fascinating. So through these wars, through adopting some Western practices, through being the world's leading nation in technology in the 1980s, it's never, ever lost its identity. If you go to Japan, nobody could say, oh, this country is totally westernized, even though superficially it sort of seems that it is. But you quickly realize that it isn't. And I think that's fascinating about Japan. I couldn't even begin to understand how and why that happened, but it is noticeable when you travel there.
So fascinating.
Yeah. Did you watch that movie, that masterpiece by the Russian director Sokurov, The Sun?
No, I think I'm good. I have to stop that conversation. You're going to need to tell me about it because I haven't seen the movie.
Right. So it's not. I'm not going to tell you the.
I'm not going to tell you.
I'm not going to
spoil
anything
on it, please.
Anyway, it's a bit of a masterpiece, and Sokurov made 3 movies about 3 political figures, one of which about the Japanese emperor. And what he captures is the moment in which the Japanese emperor decided that he was not the son of God, and decided to disclose this information to the nation. And the movie is beautiful because it shows the humanity of this man versus the perception that society had of him as God. And when he said to the people, I'm not the son of God, which means you are not the chosen people. You are not the people that come from God. You Japanese are not the chosen ones, because I am not the descendant of God. Then in that moment, the movie shows that there was a sort of wound in Japanese society, and a lot of people committed harakiri as well as a form of, and it makes me think also of Mishima's death, I don't know. I feel like there is an element, a mystical element that, from what I read, that I can't really grasp because I'm not Japanese. But there is a mystical element to it that dates far back.
Well, again, Jupi, I'm speculating because I think even if one was Japanese, these are hard questions to answer. There's no question that the defeat in the Second World War has left wounds. I mean, I grew up in Britain, and we were obviously never occupied, and we weren't defeated. But there was only one subject amongst older people 20 years after the war, which was the war. That was the only subject on offer. Everybody went back to it, whether it was how long you kept a pint of milk before it went off or whatever. I mean, just everything related. But I mean, you know, it hurt people. So if you look at what happened to Japan, apart from other European nations and other nations in Asia as well, that really had things really bad, I guess one can only speculate that there's many layers of wounds there, especially as Japan had that just like the British has that island mentality that somehow we're special. It's very embarrassing if you're British, but it seems rather romantic maybe from a foreign viewpoint if you're Japanese, but that we're somehow special and we're at the edge of the world as well in the case of Japan. So one can only speculate, but I mean, I'm assuming that's Emperor Hirohito, the wartime emperor. Yeah. There's certainly a lot of issues. And remember, in Japan, there are a lot of nationalist political parties.
Yeah, exactly.
As well. So it's not, but the Japanese people are not highly politicized. If you take a country like France, where people are highly politicized, or Britain to a lesser extent, it couldn't be more opposite in Japan. After World War II, they've adopted a position of pragmatism and to have a good and responsible life. I mean, Japan is a it's a cohesive society where people genuinely consider their role in society as individuals to be genuinely important. And they feel they can make a difference by, for example, taking their trash home. There are no trash bins in Japan. It does not exist as a concept because everybody takes their trash home and people feel they're doing something. How long that will last, one can only speculate, but I think that is something that's unique to Japan as a very wealthy nation. And maybe there's an answer in there somewhere to how they feel about their society. But anybody that's thinking of traveling to Japan, I would say, please do it. But like I would also say, as with any country, don't go to the tourist places. Don't go to Kyoto. Go to Kamakura, which was the old capital of Japan, but for a short period in the medieval period. And it's only 40 minutes from Tokyo. And it's a surf town where actually what you have there are probably, I don't know, 40 or 50 old shrines and temples. One of the world's biggest Buddhas is there. I think it's a bronze Buddha. I think it's the biggest. It's about 20 meters high, which overlooks the sea, but it overlooks people surfing and surf simulations of American surf subcultures. They'd probably get a lot more out of a visit to Japan by going to Kamakura. It's only 40 minutes on a slow train from Tokyo towards Yokohama to the southwest of Tokyo.
You convinced me, I must say.
Suddenly our podcast turned into traveling info.
No, you sold it very well. Now all I want to do is go there.
Yeah, it's a great place. It's a really great place.
Yeah.
Very good. Nick, thank you so much for this incredible conversation. I think it's so fascinating to hear perspective from someone who did it firsthand, and to also have a take on various cultures and countries and how they approach it. I think it it's very fascinating that it keeps our mind open, not only to have a perspective from one geographical location on how we interpret our identity, how we visually communicate our symbols, and also what we really sort of strive for. I think it really gives us a various perspective of analyzing and interpreting what is going on in our world, because a lot of things are happening.
Well, you've asked some great questions, and I really thank you. I was able to, I'm sorry it wasn't a discussion, but able for me to talk about a lifelong interest.
Yeah, I think it was pretty instructive, certainly for us, and I hope for our listeners as well.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Until next time, Culture Gone Bad says goodbye.
Thank you, bye.